but we only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book.
I've done a lot of prophecy teaching over the years, and in years past I have taught that verse 8 of Matthew 24, but these are merely the beginning of birth pangs. I've taught those birth pangs are part of the signs of the coming of the tribulation, that it's prior to the tribulation. You have a different view. Explain to me why I'm wrong.
Well, birth
He's
pains
wrong a
don't
lot,
last.
by the way.
Yeah, within that metaphor of a 9-month pregnancy and then the birth pangs, I don't know about you, but my wife, our last child, the time we got her in the front door of the hospital, was born 23 minutes later. So birth pains last longer for some people, but that relates to the tribulation because that's the context of the passage, and the birth pangs are used. I forget which passage. It's in the book.
It is.
Time or two in the Old Testament. And people like Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who is a good friend of mine, who I disagree with at this point, and he was discipled by a guy way back from the 50s and 60s, who, in my opinion, was still part of that shift away from historicism on the Olivet Discourse. Says that this is World War I and World War II and all of these kinds of things. And those are so hard to really establish some historical event like that in the church age. But I think it's clearly talking about, the last hour or two before birth, which would more line up with the tribulation than with the other thing.
Okay. I'm convinced.
Don't you think all of this controversy, whether it's the second coming or the rapture of the church in the tribulation period, would be resolved if people would just look at the context and use a good literal hermeneutic? Wouldn't that solve almost most of the interpretive problems, but they refuse to do that because they're reading in their own predisposed ideas?
Well, we all have those predisposed ideas. But yeah, that's the whole point, is trying to be disciplined in your hermeneutic, in your interpretive approach to do that. And if Jesus introduces the rapture, which he does in the Upper Room Discourse the night before he's killed, along with every other thing that he talks about there, is brand new church age truth. And 3 times in the Upper Room Discourse he says, I have more to tell you, but you're not able to bear it. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all things. And he says that 3 times in the text. And so he's laying the ground introduction to church age truth, which we know from 4 passages that I've already mentioned that say that this stuff was hidden. No, church age stuff was hidden. And so then when you get to the New Testament epistles, the Apostle Paul, some people believe 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were his first epistles. Probably, Galatians was, because of the Jerusalem Council. Depends on where you date those things. And so that was a polemical thing. But right when he gets into it, writing epistles, it's related to brand new church age truth, you see. And so you have the eschatology of the church being introduced in Paul's earliest epistles there, and that's when he discusses the rapture. And we have, I don't know if I have it in this book, but when you, because it's not about the rapture, but a guy back in the 60s, a Mennonite, showed that there's an exact thought-for-thought progression between John 14, 1 through 3 in 8 progressions, and 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul talks about the rapture. There's an exact parallel thought for thought between those 2 passages, which shows that he, in 1 Thessalonians, he's talking about what Jesus introduced. And he studied every eschatological passage relating to the second coming or rapture, and there's no other example that follows like that. And to me, that's further substantiation, that he's talking about a brand new thing just being introduced, in the church age, which Christ introduces, you know.
Yeah. Let's talk about one of the most abused verses by people. It's verse 13. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. What's going on there?
Well, that's talking about at the midpoint of the tribulation, right before the Antichrist comes in, because we know from the book of Revelation that, you know, the covenant, and really the book of Daniel, the covenant is made between the Antichrist and the Jewish nation. And it's not that the tribulation itself is, the first half is peaceful. It's talking about the relationship between the Antichrist and Israel. And so that peace treaty lasts for the first 3.5 years. And so therefore, by verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of by Daniel the prophet, flee. And so the Jews flee and they go to Petra. They're in southern Israel or Jerusalem area, and they're preserved there supernaturally, as Revelation 12 describes, in the second half of the tribulation. So that's what he's talking about in verse 13 leads up to that. Let's see. I've already forgot what it says. It says, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. He's talking about a person physically, a Jewish person, physically making it to the end of the tribulation where Christ will come and rescue them. So it's not a verse about,
Salvation.
right, it's not related to that. And
Is it physical deliverance?
right, and you have two passages in Revelation that say very similar things.